Okay, calm down.
I'm going to ask you a question, Briahna, because your name came up in my mind when I was reading something, and I want to hear your reaction. As you guys know, Briahna and I had a disagreement about the slogan "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." So a few days ago, Syed Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, he gave a major speech in Lebanon. And at one point, Nasrallah raised the issue of from the river to the sea. And he said, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, basically. And then he said, all those Jews in Israel, he doesn't call it Israel, the Zionist entity, all those Jews have double passports. There are Israeli Brits, Israeli French. They all have double passports. He then said, Israel is not really a nation. Israeli Jews aren't really a nation because whenever there's trouble, they run away. That's what he said. Real nations, they stay put and they fight. He says, the Israelis, no, they run away. And then he said, well, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. The land belongs to the indigenous population, the Palestinians. All the Jews should leave. So when I read that, I thought about you, Briahna, and I thought to myself, well, that's exactly the argument I was making, that it's a legitimate interpretation of from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, that a legitimate interpretation is that everybody who's not Jewish doesn't belong there and should leave.
You mean everyone who's not Arab?
Right. It's not their country. They're not really a nation. They should get up and leave. And would you accept that as a legitimate interpretation of that slogan? That's my first question, because that's how Nasrallah interpreted it. And secondly, do you think that's a legitimate demand?
I just want to say there are obviously still people who use that phrase who don't mean that.
Right. I would say, first of all, that the Likud party, whose charter in existence is older than Hamas, has in their foundational charter the phrase between the sea and Jordan, there will be only Israeli sovereignty. That is at no point in time ever interpreted to be a genocidal statement, even though I would argue that the behavior of the Likud party is certainly much more genocidal than anything that Hamas or any other Palestinian entity has ever put into effect. You've put forward that apparently the Hezbollah leader has made similar statements, and we just heard Netanyahu, although there's some dispute around the translation, making the same or similar statements. I think substantively, even if there's a translation is a little different, it sounds just like the Likud party statement. So even if it's not the exact words, the point is everything left of the Jordan, west of the Jordan River should be Israel, and not anything Palestinian. I don't believe you should stop saying words that you believe simply because someone else who's bad uses the same framing or same phrase. I think there were people who said, let's say, Black power and Black militancy, who were more militant and more open to the idea of killing white people than others who said Black power and just basically meant you should have a good self-esteem and love your natural hair. And I don't think the flexibility and the expansiveness of the English language should put me in some defensive position where I'm not allowed to use words that are meaningful to me, and that I am perfectly happy to clarify and explain if anybody wants to ask me a follow-up question. I don't think that I should be running away from my own phraseology simply because other people in the world want to mimic my words. If that's the standard, then you can easily see that any slogan adapted can be weaponized by any bad faith actor through the simple act of mimicry. Someone could say ceasefire now actually means that Hamas must stand down. And so therefore I'm going to protest in the street, ceasefire now, but I am a Zionist entity and saying ceasefire now means Hamas needs to do a ceasefire now. And if Zionists wanted to organize like that and try to co-opt that language and write op-eds in the New York Times, they might be able to get some traction there. Does that mean I'm going to stop saying ceasefire now? My fundamental argument with you, Norm, is that this would be a more compelling case on your end if the ceasefire now side of things, if the um, Israel is committing a genocide view of things weren't an ascending point of view, that hearts and minds weren't being won in larger and larger numbers. If 66% of Americans and almost 80% of Democrats weren't in line with the view that Israel needs to do a ceasefire, that they're behaving disproportionately, and the sheer volume of human death in Gaza is unconscionable. But I just don't understand why I would be at all in taking a defensive posture and changing my language, or not mine literally, but the pro-Palestinian advocates' language, when they are winning this rhetorical battle for the first time in the history of this conflict. More people, especially in the younger age group, are more sympathetic to Palestinians than to Israelis.
From the river to the sea means different things to different people. And just because you use a particular word or phrase or slogan differently than I do, doesn't make me responsible for the way that you use it. I mean, it's a bit like saying you can't call yourself a communist without taking responsibility for the Cambodian genocide. So that would be my first statement. You and I can have ascribed very different meanings to the same concept, and that doesn't make either of them illegitimate, or rather, if I mean something in a certain way, I can't be held responsible for the meaning you ascribe to that. The second point I would make is I'm not aware that this is, I mean, I'm assuming what you're saying about Nasrallah is correct. I'm not aware of this consistently being his position in recent years, whether he's referred to this point at all, and if he has, whether he's made it. And I would argue that it also reflects, in a sense, genocide blowback. Not that Hezbollah was ever a proponent of a negotiated peace with Israel. But I think what you're seeing now is that there is a sector of society that was previously amenable to either peaceful coexistence with Israel as a state or peaceful coexistence with Israeli Jewish society, that as a result of the genocidal campaign Israel has waged during the past 3 months, is no longer prepared to entertain such notions. People have come to oppose the very principle of peaceful coexistence with a genocidal state, even if they still believe that theoretically peaceful coexistence with Israel could be possible. And again, for many people, that means that the Israeli state must be dismantled and that Israeli Jewish society will have to accept living as equals in that territory. And for other people, like this statement, it means that those who immigrated from elsewhere should return to their lands of origin. So there's, again, different ways of looking at the same issue.
I would just add, I think there are two aspects, as I've said in private conversation with Mouin and my other young colleague and comrade, Jamie Stern Weiner. There are two aspects. Number one, as Mouin says, after the commission in broad daylight of a genocide, it's hardened the other side for very understandable reasons about the prospect of living in peaceful coexistence. But I believe, as I've said to Mouin, and you can comment now, there's the other side. The other side is October 7th transmitted the message far and wide that Israel's not invincible.
It's vulnerable.
And that there is a military option against it. We don't have to compromise with it. Lo and behold, this ragtag army succeeded in a way that they didn't even imagine. They didn't realize it was so easy to penetrate the perimeter of Israel. They were shocked. And so the willingness to enter into any kind of compromise has been significantly undermined by the prospect. Why do we need to compromise with it? Victory is within reach.
That's part of it as well. You also had a particular point of view, which is, well, we may not want to coexist peacefully with Israel, but given the power disparity, it's something we'll have to learn to live with. And as Norm points out, those people will now be looking at the equation and say, well, maybe it's different. Israel is vulnerable. Israel can be defeated. Will Israel survive a prolonged war of attrition on multiple fronts, and so on?
That's why I'm very, very skeptical about any possibility of this conflict ending soon. Mm-hmm. Because Israel's most central goal has always been, from the point of view of foreign policy internationally, has been to maintain what it calls its deterrence capacity, right, namely the Arab world's fear of it. And after October 7th, its deterrence capacity collapsed. It was
the iron wall melted.
Yes, it was a catastrophe. And they're now in a state of complete panic. They can't seem to be able to inflict a military defeat on Hamas. They are being mocked and taunted, and also at war, low-level war, but still war, with Hezbollah in the north, which means on every front and in totality, their deterrence capacity has been reduced to a near zero.
And genocide hasn't restored it.
And genocide hasn't restored it. And so they are going to do what it takes, because that's their primary goal, to restore their deterrence capacity.